Welcome. This is Chapter 7, using Object-Oriented JavaScript. So let's jump right into it, shall we? So in this class, we're going to talk a lot about the basic concepts related to OOP. We're also going to talk and go over the date, number, and math objects. And we're also going to talk about how to define your own custom JavaScript objects. So, what is object-oriented programming? Well, it's a lot of things. I know that this says that it allows you to reuse code without having to copy and recreate it, but it's more than that. It's a compilation of principles that make your code scalable and usable at a level that is higher than what declarative or functional programming can do for you. So long ago, there were 4 different principles that were created where object-oriented programming was concerned: abstraction, polymorphism, inheritance, and encapsulation. Abstraction is basically exactly what it sounds like, but it's more than what it sounds like. You're creating abstract objects that can be reused over and over again throughout the code. For instance, an abstract class is an abstract object which can be reused over and over again throughout your code. Yada, yada, yada. Polymorphism is the ability to create modulars or modules within your code so that they can be invoked throughout your code. Now, I understand that there's a more dynamic and academic way to explain that, but that's really what it is. Encapsulation is being able to hide your algorithms within your code so that they can't be manipulated outside of your code, and or protect or privatize them so they're not accessible to any other parts of your code. This is a security feature in object-oriented programming. And lastly, there's inheritance. Inheritance is the ability to inherit objects, inherit functions, inherit variables, whatever, from another class altogether. Now, I don't think that object-oriented programming is, in its purest form, can be attributed to JavaScript, but certain parts of object-oriented programming can. So, for instance, inheritance does not exist in JavaScript in the way that we understand it exists in C#, Java, C, and C++. Polymorphism does, where we can modularize or create modules within the code that allow us to reuse pieces of the code within that script file or that HTML document. Also, JavaScript does employ abstraction at a very simple level. Data types are quite dynamic and, for the most part, ignored in JavaScript, but that doesn't take away from its abstractive properties. And like inheritance, encapsulation is another piece of JavaScript which can or cannot be attributed to object-oriented programming in JavaScript as a language. For the most part, encapsulation is used in C# and C++ and Java, and in most situations, you can see it in action, whereas in JavaScript you can't. So, as we said in the last slide, object-oriented programming allows you to create reusable software objects and easily incorporate this into multiple programs. Now, the issue with this is that JavaScript is inherently siloed, meaning that only one JavaScript file can contain or access the functions of that file. You could try to make those methods or functions, you could try to make your functions accessible to other JavaScript files in your code, but it's not as easy as it looks, which is why there's AngularJS as a framework and whatnot to allow you to do that. What's the object in your code? It's the code and or data that's treated like an individual unit or component. So for the most part, an object can be anything. Anything and nothing all at the same time. A variable is an object. A function is an object. A method is an object. Now, if you're talking in terms of a data type, an object is anything that has not been predefined as a integer, float, string, yada, yada, yada. It's pretty much a thing that has no value, no data type value. In JavaScript, an object is pretty much anything. The data is information, and this definition is already incorrect, but I'm going to quote it anyway because I don't want to confuse you. Data is information contained within variables or other types of storage structures. If you've taken SQL or any type of data class, you will know that data and information are not one and the same. Data is a value at its purest form. Information is a compilation of different data sets or different datum that make the data valuable. So for instance, if I had your address and your address was 123 Bear Lane, 123 Bear Lane in and of itself is information. But what if I only had the number of your street, 123? Or let's take it a step further. What if I only had the first digit of the number of your street, 1? Well, that's data. It has no inherent meaning whatsoever, but it is a piece of value that we can put together with other pieces of value to create information. So within the context of this definition, data being information is kind of a paradox or an oxymoron, if you will. It's the other way around. Data is really, that should be replaced with the word values contained within variables or other types of storage structures. So, objects range from simple controls to entire programs. And we've just talked about all that. So, we can create our own objects. We can manipulate objects that are created by programmers. And then by combining the two or using one and or the other, we then create our program. So what's encapsulation? And I know I went over this very briefly. Encapsulation is code and data contained within the object itself. Encapsulation places code inside of a black box. Now, I just actually went over this with you. Encapsulation allows you to create a pseudo-security for your code. It's the idea of obstruction through information hiding. I'm not saying that correctly, but for the most part, what it is you're hiding your core algorithms away from outside influencers. Remember we talked last week about information security and how there are individuals with malicious intent who can manipulate your code by injecting JavaScript into your DOM. Encapsulation allows, even if that code is injected into your DOM, that they can't manipulate your algorithms. The principle of information hiding is that any method or property that other programmers do not need to access should be hidden. So the advantage of encapsulation, as we've already stated, is that it reduces code complexity and it prevents accidental bugs and stealing of code. One other added benefit is that your algorithms stay the way they should stay. So they're using a calculator, an actual handheld calculator, as a example. And in this example, you are, or you, the program, the hand, is asking the object, the calculator object, for a specific value. And what we do is we present the program with a set of interfaces and properties to manipulate, but it never really gets the opportunity to actually go inside the calculator and manipulate the algorithms itself. So the document object is encapsulated in a black box. This is true. The getElementById method is part of the interface JavaScript uses to communicate with the document object. So, and then it uses Microsoft Word as an example. But just know that we ourselves don't go into the DOM and pick out IDs. We use a method, and the method goes and gets that specific tag. That is a form of encapsulation. However, I would argue that that's not necessarily JavaScript itself doing that, but c'est la vie. So classes. This is something that JavaScript doesn't necessarily have. Well, I have a sneaking suspicion that this slideshow is going to try to discredit what I'm about to say. JavaScript, one of its main drawbacks is that it doesn't have classes. Now, what are classes? Classes are groups of code, methods, and attributes that make up an object or hold a compilation of like objects. So you can create a class called the print class. And in that print class, the only things that are there are things which either assist or operate a print type property. An instance is an object created from an existing class. So when you get the error, object not reference to an instance of an object, that error is actually telling you that the instance that you are trying to invoke does not exist. The word instantiation I've used a lot throughout this class. Instantiation means to create an object from an existing class. If I wanted to instantiate a variable, I can instantiate a variable from another class. Instance of an object inherits its methods and properties from a class. Objects in the browser object model, are part of the web browser, do not have a need for instantiation. They already exist within the context of your code. You don't have to construct them. Hence the reason why we don't write constructors for JavaScript like we do in other languages. And here are some built-in JavaScript classes that we manipulate every now and again. Now, I myself wouldn't call these things classes. They're part of the library, but I understand where they're going with this. Instantiating an object is the ability to actually take an object and use it where you need to use it. So we can use the math object pi property in a script, for example. What we're actually doing in this script, and I was reading it just to get an idea, is that we're instantiating the math object, and then we're using the math object to do a calculation. So in this case, math.pi will give you 3.14 and whatever the subsequent numbers after that are. Math.pow is a method that will give you area, I believe, or perimeter. I don't remember what it actually does, but it does a calculation as well, and then you can calculate both answers and return area. But the instantiation of the math object is what they're talking about here. And you've done instantiation throughout this class already. As a matter of fact, inadvertently, you have done instantiation when you've loaded a getElementById.value into a variable and then use that. You can instantiate arrays. You can instantiate this as an empty generic object, but object literal is the right name. Object literal here. And object literal is exactly what I was telling you it is earlier. It's a hash table, really. That's all it is. The difference between an object literal and an array is that the array only possesses a value. It possesses nothing else but the value. Whereas the object literal contains your key and a value, so that you can use dot notation to pull one or the other. However, you cannot use an object literal for a date object. You can only use a constructor new date. It is one of the only objects in the JavaScript library that you have to instantiate new.